Hey guys, my name is Jordan Koss. Welcome to the Almost Essential podcast. This 16-episode series is based off my final project for my Doctorate of Ministry degree at Fuller Theological Seminary. The title of that final project is Almost Essential Evangelists, Improving Retirement Asset Accumulation for Mainstream Church of Christ Pastors. In this series, we will interview 8 different specialists in 8 separate episodes. And we will also interview 2 pastors from each of 8 different regions around the U.S. This final project was inspired by 10 years of ministry in 3 different churches of Christ from Georgia to Northern California from 2010 to 2019, as well as my time as a financial professional in training in 2020. That is where I learned about the retirement crisis America is in and will be experiencing in the coming years. Now, I have 3 goals for this podcast. 1, provide an accessible, denomination-specific qualitative conversation for Church of Christ pastors and leaders. 2, introduce leaders and listeners to retirement vehicles and strategies they may not have heard about before. And 3, provide encouragement, motivation, and knowledge to save for the last third of life. Thank you for listening and enjoy. So welcome to the Almost Essential podcast. My name is Jordan Koss. I'm with Lars Coburn, my co-host, and this is, I think, episode 8 of our 16-episode series. We have a very, very special guest with us today. But first, Lars, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself a little bit for our viewers and listeners?
Yeah, so here in the kind of rainy, wet weather of the Pacific Northwest in Eugene, Oregon, and I get to serve as Director of Church Relations, University Relations in Bushnell University's Advancement Office. So trying to grow the university through raising money and telling stories. And I get to be part of some initiatives like this where we're asking some questions about the health of pastors. And so I'm really invested in this, not just because I served for almost 8 years as a youth minister, a family pastor at a local church, and I'm still involved preaching at local churches. I care about my friends in ministry, but I'm also caring about this project from a university standpoint. How can universities and education institutions help share good resources with others? So I hope this Almost Essential podcast will be a good resource for pastors and churches.
Yeah, same here. And so thank you for that intro, Lars. And with us today as our special guest is Stan Granberg. Stan, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself for those who haven't heard of you before?
I'm the older guy in the bunch here, in case you can't figure that out. I grew up in the Northwest, in the Seattle area, and went to Harding University, and from there over to Memphis to, at that point, Harding University Graduate School of Religion, which is now Harding School of Theology.
Mm-hmm.
Then I went into the mission field after a few years of youth work, went to Kenya, spent 10 years church planting and leadership development in Kenya. I came back from there and finished up a degree at Fuller Theological Seminary, and then was teaching at Lubbock Christian University and Cascade College. I got my doctorate degree from the Oxford Center for Mission Studies in Oxford, England, through the Open University. And then in 2004, resigned from teaching and started Kairos Church Planting and worked in that for 15 years. Just helping new churches get started across the country here in the U.S. So I've been a missionary evangelist. That would be how I would characterize my career. Now I'm back in the Seattle area, in the very sunny and bright Seattle area at the moment, and enjoying life at the early part of retirement.
That's great. I was in Seattle right before Christmas as part of the whole Southwest airline debacle. I was stuck in Seattle for about a day and a half, but was able to get out with a rental car, thankfully. My goodness. It was a beautiful view from the airport, though, of Seattle. Thankful to get out of that. That was quite the story. But I had you. Oh yeah.
That was tough.
It was tough. It was tough. But I had you as a professor, I don't know, back in the late 2000s at Harding School of Theology for, I believe the class was Global Evangelism. Yeah.
Right,
So, yep.
right.
So, yeah, awesome. Grateful that you have joined us today. First question. Let's get started here. How was just basically you're retired? You mentioned how's your retirement going, and what's been your plan in terms of funding your last sort of life as a missionary, professor, minister within Churches of Christ?
Well, as Churches of Christ, there isn't really any kind of a retirement system in place, so it's all a ad hoc, do-it-yourself type
Right.
system.
Yeah.
I started thinking about retiring a long time ago. Probably people who were mentors in my life talking about it, but probably my retirement follows what a lot of guys did when I first started. We were pretty much encouraged to get out of the Social Security system. And so I did, based on that advice, a little bit also because it was difficult to afford it
Right.
at that time of life. But with better advice from mentors, as soon as I was able to do so, I got back into it. And so that's kind of been the foundation piece. You need to have that. It's there. It's available. But I would say my most influential person, advice-wise, was my dad.
Okay.
And he had some rental properties, and I'd go over and help him get them cleaned up and things. And we had some interesting stories
I
from
bet.
some of the renters that he had. But from that, I had that interest in it. And so I guess I would say that my retirement is based on the Social Security. And then we tried we tried mutual funds, never were able to make mutual funds work very well for us. The ups and downs were always, they just kind of canceled everything out.
Right.
We did have then, I'd say, on top of Social Security, we had some indexed annuities and whole life policies. And so that provides that kind of that second very consistent layer. But our primary vehicle has been real estate. So I tell people I started with the cheapest drug house I could find in Portland, Oregon, and moved up from there to the next better drug house. It was a triplex, and then moved from there to into some commercial real estate, and we have I think a very comfortable retirement from that.
Okay, that's awesome. Lars, any follow-up questions to that?
Yeah, so any issues with kind of getting back into Social Security, or any advice you would have to, say, somebody who maybe did opt out and is concerned about opting back in? What would you say to somebody who maybe has been kind of on that train for a while? Maybe they took some of that advice. I know it's not as common to hear anymore for younger ministers, but what would you maybe say to somebody who's listening who took that advice and they're thinking maybe the ship has sailed? Any thoughts, Stan, since you had that experience?
They've offered periodically windows to let people back in, and that's what I took advantage of. So I haven't paid attention to how often they do that, or what gets that tripped so it's an open window.
Yeah.
But boy, if a window comes open, need to take it is what I would tell people. Theologically, I don't think our background has a theological issue at all with Social Security.
Okay.
I think some places in our background, there's probably some of that. Coming out of Lipscomb and Harding, there may be some reluctance, but I don't feel like most people in our fellowship find that. In fact, I would say most people would say, why would you ever, opt out? The other thing is, they were always saying, well, by the time you retire, there won't be any Social Security. Well,
Right.
it has changed definitely, and it will probably change in the future. But I doubt it's going away. So that's would be the second piece. I guess the third would be make sure you can get your 40 quarters in. As if someone's old enough where that's going to be very difficult to get the 40 quarters in, got to make sure, I'd say that Medicare is available. That's probably one of the big advantages of our Social Security system, because otherwise I just don't know what you would do on the medical insurance.
Right.
It's just so difficult at this point. So I guess that's my thoughts there, but I hope people would take advantage of any opportunity to get back in the system if they ever did opt out at some point.
So when you say 40 quarters, that's paying into Social Security for at least 40 quarters of
Right.
1 year is 4 quarters?
Right.
Okay.
So you got to get those 10 years of work in.
Gotcha.
And some people, they might have some work history in their background, and get online, get your account set up so you can look and see and find out how many quarters you have, because they have it all listed out there.
Yeah.
And just make sure that the things come together for you. But I would just absolutely say get into it. I just don't think there's any real downsides to it, and it kind of forces us to pay into it and get that foundational piece in place for retirement when that comes to be.
Yeah. Great. And so real estate has always interested me. And I'm not yet, I haven't tried yet to get into it, but I want to. So what would you say, what piece of advice for a COC pastor is looking for some passive income to help bolster his preparation for saving for retirement? What kind of advice would you get to kind of jump into that?
Well, real estate isn't a passive income piece. It's a very active, it's a very active piece.
Got it.
I think where I've gotten to, it's much more passive than it's ever been. But I like to tell people when they ask, so what's that like? I say, well, the first day on the job, I got bit by a Rottweiler, and it went up from there. So, I had several things that was working with for me. One, I wanted my two boys to be able to work on houses. And so, we bought things that we did fixer-uppers with. We didn't do the flips that are so, people, think that's kind of the in thing today.
Right.
But I had my boys, and we were in some stable places, so we were able to move them on for 4 or 5 years, and then sell it and gain the appreciation, and then turn that over into the next one, and kind of keep moving up on it. I never really took any money from my real estate until we retired, so everything always went back into it. So it always kind of was a pot that was growing over onto the side, and I was always managing it, taking care of it. But there might be something I'd buy a birthday present for someone or something like that. But mostly everything that came with it always was turned back into it.
Okay.
And then that allowed us to do all the advancements on the properties that we needed to do, because we bought at the low end of things, and then got them looking good and working well, and then we're able to sell them and gain that appreciation. Of course, we were doing that mostly up here in the Northwest, where there was good appreciation. Some parts of the country, like the middle parts, you don't get much appreciation, so you got to do something that's income generating. And so you got to look and see how that works. I would say it's an interest thing. It's certainly not for everybody to do. And for most ministers, it's probably a little more of an iffy, harder piece, unless you just really have an interest in it, because it takes a lot of time, and you have to have a certain emotional emotional approach to it, because you start getting a call in the middle of the night and something's happened and you got to go take care of something, or when you're, you start becoming friends with the local law enforcement because of bad tenants. There's just some downsides to it. So you have to develop that sense of this is good and I can handle this. And if you can't, then I wouldn't get into it.
Sure.
But for us, it's been very good. It's been very good. It's been a real blessing to us, and we've, for the most part, we've enjoyed that ride, along the way. But we started 1997.
Okay.
And then retired in 2019. Got everything ready for our full retirement in 2021. We kind of finished everything out real estate wise for it. So, it's not too late. If you get 15, 20 years, it can do very well for people.
Okay. All right. Great. All right, shifting gears a little bit into one of the articles that you've written in the recent past that was published back in 2018, a case study of growth and decline, Churches of Christ from 2006 to 2016. I remember listening to a podcast by Bob Turner where he was talking about your article with another minister in the Memphis area and how that one other minister kind of took the data and saw how the county that Memphis was in, how they were kind of like a microcosm of the overall decline of Churches of Christ in the entire country. But what was the big picture that you learned within that research, within that study, and how do you see the big picture of what you found impacting COC pastors and saving for retirement?
Okay, let me kind of get some background to that. When we were getting ready to go to Kenya in the early 1980s, Abilene Christian University had a summer seminar on missions. And so we went to that for 2 years. And I was introduced from Wendell Broom, who was kind of one of my hero mentors through the years, to this idea of church growth studies. And just the phraseology of church growth that came out of Fuller Theological Seminary and Donald McGavran. So it was kind of it was an approach to try to, as McGavran called it, to take away the fog of not knowing.
Yeah.
And what it did for me, it changed my expectation of being a pastoral leader. I'd say I was trained to be a pastor, a counselor, not a leader, not someone who was apostolic, not a prophetic style of ministry at all. Very kind of almost in our fellowship, a second tier leadership role. When you ask almost anyone in our congregations who your leaders, they're going to say first their elders, and then they're going to go to their deacons, and then they'll get to their hired hand ministers.
Yeah.
And I think that's been a bit of a crippling piece for us. And we've promoted it through our schools and through our university education processes. So our very apostolic, dynamic, prophetic leaders, they've tended to go somewhere else. So that gave me a different mindset. And when we went to Kenya, we were starting something from scratch, and we thought, we're getting a big investment in this. So what's the return on investment for the kingdom going to be? And every year we would do those church growth studies to see what's going on. How are we doing? Are we doing well? Are we making progress? What are the issues? How do we make plans for the future and set goals and objectives for the future? I don't hear that very often from many of our churches at all. So I'm sure we'll talk about my book, Empty Church, but most of our church leadership is based on maintenance and not missional. And that church growth study moved me to a missional mindset. So it gave me the tools, gave me the background. When we left in 1983 for Kenya, our fellowship was at its high. It was dynamic. It felt like the world was its oyster. We could do anything, go anywhere.
Yeah.
Money was pretty free. Churches were building buildings. They were building bigger buildings. They were adding on to their buildings. When we came back, it had been a shift. And that shift was only intuited by most people in the mid 1990s. It was kind of intuited, but no one really saw anything of danger on the sight lines. So as I got into our education system, and I had a lot of students who could do research, on the ground, particularly when I got up to Cascade in Portland, Oregon. I had my students in a class or two. Well, actually, it was a class that was a repeating class. So about every year, I'd have about 8 or 10 students that were doing church growth studies on their churches, mostly from Washington, Oregon, Idaho, California, some from Alaska. I ended up with almost 150 studies of local congregations. And every one of those studies, except for 2, it was here was our growth until about 1980 to 90, and then it started down. And by the time, this was in the early 2000s, they were maybe half their size, and still not seeing any danger signs. But when I put all that together, in the northwestern states, Churches of Christ had already peaked and had lost about 20% of the bulk of our members and adherents by 2000. And so that began for me to set the alarm bells off. I went in and talked to our president at Cascade about it. And, as a president, you got to raise money. You raise money from people in churches. And when there's not very many churches, and when people are not very engaged out of those, it's hard to raise money. And so we talked through that some, and he said it's just very difficult.
Yeah.
So when 2004 came around, and there was just a big challenge God laid out there through the Christian churches that were planting churches just very successfully. And that's where I got into the church planting process to try to bring some kind of a renewal and rejuvenation, because we had gotten off of our mission. So that's kind of the background to that bigger study. So in 1996, I had data that I'd gathered, and then when 2006 came around, they gave me that good 11-year window to do a traditional technical church growth study of Churches of Christ. So I used the information from our Churches of Christ in the U.S. out of Nashville and Carl Royster, and pulled that together. And I called, as I was doing that, I called Flavel Yakeley Jr., who was Cersei at the time. He'd been our statistician for the Churches of Christ. And I asked Flavel, I said, Flavel, is it okay with you if I do this? And he said, go for it. And when Flavel was doing his work, he was very careful to couch his findings in a way that didn't disturb people. By the time I came to it, I felt like I needed to couch it in ways that created a great disturbance in people. Because things had shifted. So our fellowship hit our fulcrum, hit our high point somewhere, maybe 85, 90, somewhere in there. And we've been on that decline. And I think the publishing of that article officially put us in a declining church context, in the United States. So that's the big picture. We are a declining church.
And we've been declining for about over 30 years now. And so thank you for that overview and background. Is Kairos the only church planting organization within Churches of Christ? Or are there other non-official?
Well, Mission Alive,
Okay.
started out of Abilene. Galen Van Reenen and
Okay.
I both were in Kenya together, and kind of both started Mission Alive with Galen, and I started Kairos Church Planting at about the same time. And
Okay.
then there's some that are out of out of some churches. It's in North Boulevard in Murfreesboro, Tennessee.
Right.
Has a pretty active church planting ministry. It is mostly in the Southern Hemisphere,
Mm-hmm.
2/3 world type pieces. As God brought his challenge to them, they wanted to plant 60,000 churches, and they realized they would not plant 60,000 in the U.S. So they went to these more receptive fields to do that. But they are doing some church planting in the U.S. So Harding has had some initiatives. ACU has had some initiatives in church planting. But people have asked me. They say, "Well, Stan, why do we need both Mission Alive and Kairos?" And I harken back to the Christian churches. I said, "That's not the right question.
Yeah.
The question is, why do we only have
Mm-hmm.
Mission Alive and Kairos?
Mm-hmm.
Why don't we have 30 or 40 of these ministries that can really tackle their regions and know those regions and bring initiatives and engagement to them?"
Yeah.
So, we have been in the past a very deeply engaged church planting group.
Mm-hmm.
Most places I go, I'll kind of fish around to say, how did this congregation get started? And in any area, if you go back 2 generations of people, they know the people who started half a dozen churches here or a dozen churches there, went down the road, down the street, across the Vale, and started churches. But we got away from that. We lost that perspective in our fellowship.
Yeah. Yeah. I have a pretty interesting just history of growing up in Church of Christ. I've experienced multiple different regions within my first 18 years of life. I was born and raised at a church in downriver Detroit in Lincoln Park, Michigan, which was founded in the 1920s by people moving from the South up north to work in the auto industry, etc. And my grandmother was a secretary there. My dad had served in leadership, still serves in leadership there as an elder. And back in the early 90s, back in like 91, 92, we moved to outside of Philadelphia, and we went to a church in Exton, Pennsylvania, which was a very different in many ways, just culturally, etc. But the congregations there were smaller compared to what I had known in the Midwest. And then the final year or two of high school, I experienced what it was like to live and go to church in the Bible Belt in Middle Tennessee, McMinnville, Tennessee. And that was just kind of like, wait, what's a youth group? Like, whoa, these churches are big. This is kind of freaking me out because I was a Yankee. I wasn't used to big churches. But that was an interesting experience, just those first 18 years alone before getting into ministry or 3 different churches over the course of 10 years.
You go to Nashville, and on Sunday afternoons, Sunday mornings, they have policemen out on the roads directing traffic to get people in and out of the parking lots. You think, where's that come from?
Yeah, totally. Lars, you were about to say something?
Well, yeah. So, I mean, I feel like I was born at the wrong time, Stan, for our movement to some degree. We sometimes described our ministry in these churches on the West Coast as a ministry of retreat. And actually, most of the time, it wasn't even that. It was just an acceptance, finally, sometimes of these trends. So, I mean, I was born in 1991 in Portland, and the church really hit its peak right about that time when I was 5, 6 years old. 2 services, several hundred people. We moved back to Portland in 99. And I would say the church was at its kind of precipice. And it was only a couple of years later, by 2004, that they had shrunk and were continuing to shrink. And then eventually they had to sell that building that they had built on. I mean, they had added on. I think they had maybe built it in the late 80s, early 90s, something like that. And then they added on to it in the late 90s, early 2000s. And, so my memory of that church, which I thought was kind of one of the larger ones in Portland, There's still one or two that are big, but for the most part, it used to be we'd get together with the 7 or 8 large churches in the Portland metro area and had these big events together, and a worship service once a year all together down at the convention center. And now I talk to ministers up there, and it's, there's maybe 1 or 2 churches left that are even close to the size of each of those churches. And the same could be true about the churches I served in Southern California. Canyon View Church of Christ in San Diego was a merger of 2 churches in the early 90s, about 91, I think, and Pacific Beach Congregation in Claremont. And they hit their zenith as they added on to their building with a multipurpose room that then was supposed to be have a sanctuary added on overlooking the canyon. And that project never got off the ground. And I think it was 2005 that they went from their peak 500, 600 to a slow decline. And by the time I left there, it was, smaller than 250. So I don't know where they're at right now, but when I visited again, they were one of the largest. We jokingly called them the Helms Deep of Churches of Christ in San Diego. So if the Church of Christ at 250 is the largest one in San Diego County, this huge county now, and Portland, I can think of a church of 3 or 4, maybe 400 now, is the largest church there in Tigard, in this large metropolitan area of Portland. What can we do in these churches, in your mind? Is it smaller mini churches, and just not trying to get back to what we had at the zenith, kind of, or are there things that some of these churches who maybe still have the size, are there things you would recommend that they can do? And then we'll continue on to the retirement questions. But before we move on from that, I'd be curious if you have some thoughts for those churches that are kind of hanging on, that maybe are the Helms Deep, if you like the Lord of the Rings analogy, where people are fleeing, if you will, from the dying churches, and they're coming to kind of the last one that's the refuge place.
Okay. I think there's some great examples of some churches that have made a transition out of the 20th century and into the 21st century. And I think that's what we've got to work with, and realize that there's a major transition that has to take place. And that is difficult. Northwest Church here in Seattle, which is the flagship Church of Christ, and they would probably not fully style themselves as a Church of Christ anymore. They merged with a Christian church, so it's very much a Stone Campbell. But you won't even very much hear Christian church stuff. But the DNA is Church of Christ, Christian Church, Stone Campbell. They made a very deliberate move out of an older building into a place that was a 10 fitness center that they renovated. But it wasn't the renovation of place, it was the renovation of mindset that they underwent. And they realized they had to become a 21st century church. And so they did that. And there are stories of that. New Vintage down in San Diego is a new church plant that Tim Spivey planted several years ago. They're a 21st century church. Luminous City is a church plant in San Diego that's going to be a good 21st century church. There are other churches that have made that move. And so I'd say the basic move is to move out of that maintenance mindset to a missional mindset. We got to get back to why do we exist and let that begin to guide us. And the questions that we need to ask are going to come from the people who we're going to find along the way, that God is going to bring to us from the harvest field. And then they're going to bring the questions that we need to start answering. And that it may sound a bit simplistic, but I think that's exactly where God has put the resources for us in his harvest, is those new people who will guide us to do the things, to be able to engage the culture around us, and churches that aren't able to do that, they will close. So that there's just no doubt that timing might be the issue on it, but churches that can't make that shift from maintenance to missional, they will close sooner than later. And that's what they have to do. It's in our blood. It's available to us, but it's going to take some real courageous leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And I see a number of bright spots around us for that. But we're going to have to recreate a new fellowship out of our old fellowship that starts in the 21st century and then moves into the 22nd, when that finally gets here.
Okay, great. So let's go on to question 3, and then I'll ask the retirement question, just based upon overall big picture of the future of Churches of Christ. In your article with Tim Woodruff of Interim Ministry Partners, Churches of Christ in 2050, which you can find for free online at their website, Interim Ministry Partners, you project a probable 30-year horizon for Churches of Christ. What was that horizon, and what impact does it have on our subject today of COC pastors and them preparing financially for retirement?
Our horizon was looking out to 2050 at the time, and we were trying to anticipate what the things would be. And so we put out 2 lines. One was kind of taking a straight line, the losses that have been documented over the last 10 years that I brought out in my 2006 study. And if we took those, we would be about half the size in numbers of churches and of members. We were up in the top 10 largest Christian religious groups in the U.S. in the 1980s and 1990s. We dropped down to number 14. But our churches have been the smallest of any of those that are over 1 million, members, adherents. We were the smallest per congregation. So we were micro churches in one sense. Nowadays, micro churches are often talked about more of 6 to 10 people, but I think the better micro churches are more around the 30-ish range. So we were mini to micro churches is kind of been our spot in things. But Tim and I also said, well, we don't anticipate, because of our mortality rate, we don't anticipate that being a straight line loss, but it being a loss that gains speed. So Lars, you used the term of cliff. Yeah, where's the cliff? Where's the Gladwell turning point where things just really drop off? And so we anticipated that would come, and then would leave us at 2050 at about 2,800 congregations, down from a high of around 13,200 congregations, and somewhere below 3,000 in our membership. And you kind of feel like that would be drastic. I think it is drastic. But there's already studies that I quoted from England, where the Anglican Church, the Methodist Church, some other churches have already undergone that, and have hit the cliff, fallen off of it, and they're down at those lower levels now. So it is a possibility and a probability for us.
Yeah, that's crazy. I think you said 250,000 membership by 2050 and 2,800 congregations. That's crazy. You also mentioned, it was in this article or the previous one we mentioned that, and Lars, you alluded to this, that the West Coast is the canary in the coal mine for Bible Belt Churches of Christ. Can you unpack that a little bit more?
I was painting a room one day, and had the radio on and listening, and there was somehow, I guess, I got Ed Stetzer, who has been a great church planting and missiologist for the Southern Baptists in the United States. And Ed said, and this was probably 12, 15 years ago now, he said, if you want to know what churches are going to be like in America in 25 years, go to Vancouver, British Columbia. And I think he's exactly right. So when Kairos started, people said you need to move down to the south. That probably for resources that would have been okay, but we were a research and development organization. And to be on the West Coast, and particularly the Northwest, gave us the room, the opportunity, and the context to do research and development on what it's going to be like. Because what are the questions people are going to ask? And they're questions that are not, they don't begin with, well, what about the Bible? They begin with, is there anything beyond what we have right here? These, the meta narratives don't work in many people's lives. They're into many narratives of what I believe and what I can construct. And that's where church planners have been working with that kind of new set of questions, new set of answers that have to be given to them. The creation of communities that learn how to stick together in life are forming in these new churches. They're learning to not fear culture around us and set up a lot of barriers to keep it out. But they are embracing the challenge of the cultures. So I'd say, having lived and worshiped in both contexts, the Southern context, Jonesboro, Arkansas, most recently, which had the nomenclature to it as the most church city in America. I don't know if it is, but that's what they said. It's certainly very highly churched. But even there, I heard those same questions beginning to be asked. And so it moves us to that very missional mindset of how do we engage the culture around us, don't get caught up in it so that it swallows us, which it does. I've seen that in multiple churches up here. It just swallowed the churches. They lost faith in Jesus. They lost faith in God as a dynamic entity in life, lost their trust in Scripture as being any kind of a divine guide for people, and lost their way. So we're going to have to be tougher skinned than we've been with the culture around us. I really appreciate Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York and how they have embraced that and modeled that.
Tim Keller's church.
Tim Keller, church, yeah. Awesome. I think Tim has been the best apologist for us in these last 25 years.
Yeah, I remember I've read some of his stuff and listened to a bunch of his stuff on YouTube, and I remember one of those, it was how he has read The Secular Age by Charles Taylor 10 times, because that's, if you want to know what it's like to try to do ministry in our culture, that's a good picture to help, at least that he helped him figure out how to do ministry in Manhattan. And a lot of my time in my DMin studies at Fuller has been writing papers in light of the literature that based upon Taylor's picture of the age of authenticity in the secular age. It's helped me out tremendously as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can think of a bunch of books on my bookshelf over here that are related to this discussion. Missional churches, some of the things you talked about earlier, for sure. As my studies at Fuller were with Mark Lau Branson and his partnership with the Canadian Alan Roxborough, they did a DMin cohort down there that I know several of our Church of Christ ministers in Southern California have been through, and it's helpful. So I'll give a shout out to Martin Rodriguez and Dan Rodriguez down at Pepperdine that I think are doing some really good work with this within our movement, primarily supporting some of the emerging and newer Hispanic Churches of Christ in Southern California that are, as you say, kind of being that new shift in imagination. So I think there are bright spots and hopes when we talk about this decline or this cliff. We also need to look for the new hopes and excitement. So I appreciate how Kairos has been part of that and your efforts over the years, but then also even as a prophet of disruption, you've also pointed us to hope. I know many times being around at Harbor at Pepperdine Bible Lectures and some of your sessions there, Were always a good part of the balance of the conversation at the conferences like that. I'd be curious to know what your thoughts are as Churches of Christ compared to other movements that are similar to us. So have you interacted with people outside of just the Restoration movement, not just the Christian churches, but other denominations, like you mentioned, Ed Stetzer and stuff like that, with some of these others? How are we doing in relationship to those other movements that might be kind of, I mean, we're evangelical adjacent, I think, so I'm not sure we fit that perfectly, but they might be the closest thing we fit to. So as you are listening and talking with other people who do this work in other denominations or in other movements, are they following a similar curve? Are they seeing similar signs as you are? Or are we kind of a little bit more unique since, as you mentioned, we're kind of the smaller micro church almost situations?
Well, it seems like every denomination is seeing the same thing. We are becoming very much, a post-Christian culture in the U.S. We're not nearly as far down, not nearly as sarcastically skeptical as European, culture is. I spent a number of years going over for 6 to 8 weeks at a time to Oxford. And so getting a sense of it there. But, there you see the Alpha course. That's just been phenomenal. It's been one of my love childs, the Alpha course. It's been phenomenal through my ministry and the use of it. But here in the States, almost every denomination is feeling it, is seeing it. So, the mainline stream, they went through it in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. Evangelicalism was said to be the bulwark of Christianity in America. So, but even evangelicalism is feeling it now. So the same things the mainline denominations experienced earlier, 30 years earlier, we're now into that. So I don't know of any denominational structures that are not feeling the pinch.
Okay.
But where I didn't work so much with the denominational structures as networks and affiliations that were substrata within those. So the PCEA, Presbyterian Church, Evangelical Free Church, and other streams, they had networks and affiliations in them. And they crossed lines sometimes. And those were the ones that were like with Kairos, they were the research and development people. They were the ones that were trying new things, because you can do that in a new church. You can try new things next week. Doesn't take next year to get to a decision. You can do it next week. And I think all of them experienced a lot of goodness and have provided opportunities for their fellowships to see hope and to learn some new habits and new ways of approaching their ministries. So that those were the ones that I've worked with, and I've seen some that have just done phenomenally. I'm thinking Gary Rohrmeyer up in the Midwest, and his group, they planted 500 churches in about 25 years through the last part of last century and beginning of this century. Just done a great work with it. Tom Niebel, another writer in the church growth world, been part of that. So there's been some good pieces, but overall, we're going to see smaller churches. The mega churches are still going to be around.
Okay.
There was Tom Rainer had a podcast a while back where he said we're going to have to reassess our metric for sizes, and he said from now on we're going to have to say a large church is 200. That's a large church. If you go to where did I recently just see this? Oksana, great group. Working with churches, doing a lot of good coaching.
Will Mancini's group, right?
Will Mancini's group that he formed, and he's gone on to other things, but that's his group. But if you look at their scale, their small church is 200.
Okay.
Their next size up is 500 to 750. I think that they're working with the real small end of the tail of church sizes. And eventually they're going to have to work down the scale. So we're going to work with smaller churches. We're going to have more bivocational and trivocational ministers. Churches with multiple staffs churches will still have them, but again, they'll be bivocational, trivocational ministry. And our financial resources are going to be more focused at that point. I don't know quite what's going to happen with buildings at this point. You go like to Asia, and not a lot of church buildings, so they're in rented space. International Churches of Christ, Boston movement, they were kind of, for us, they were the ones who were pioneering. How do you work out of rented spaces? So I'd say some churches that have buildings are going to, like the Northwest Church, go to a 7-day-a-week model of how do we be as they say, a place for the community in which a church meets. There's another one in Indianapolis. That's the same thing. They sold their building, their traditional building. They bought a warehouse. They redid it. It's now a child care center and all sorts of other things they have going in it. But they had to reformulate. We're not a church that invites people to it. We're a place where our community finds a home, and the church is part of that community. Yeah. So we're going to be more community embedded. So I'd say neighborhood style churches of around 70 to 125 are going to become much more normative. We're going to be much more focused on what's going on in our smaller neighborhood areas. And we'll have to find ways to create those networks and affiliations to get that broader geographic sense and that broader sense of identity of who we are. Okay. So those are just some of the things I see coming down the pike for the future.
Yeah. And so kind of going back to what Lars said about you being a prophet of disruption, the 5 factors that you mentioned in that article showing the 30-year horizon, the 2050 for Churches of Christ, you said, number one, the graying of the flock, older members of Churches of Christ are just simply dying, kind of creating a tsunami, if you will. And that tsunami is given speed and height by losing younger generational cohorts. They're just not staying at these churches because it seems they're geared more towards those older generations. Lack of evangelism, not bringing other people to Christ. We've already mentioned number 4, the failure to plant new churches. And number 5, you've touched on this already, polity model problems with the ecclesiological ideal of exclusive elder-led congregations, which I think out of the 5, that would be the most disruptive and perhaps nerve-striking for people in Church of Christ, which that's like the bread and butter, ecclesiological teaching in Church of Christ. It seems it has been since Alexander Campbell. And so how would you speak to somebody like my father, who's an elder at a church in Downriver, Detroit, who it was founded in the early part of the 20th century. They've kind of hit that plateau / decline. What would you have to say to him in light of our discussion today?
Probably start with gifts in ministry. It was pretty powerful at Fuller in the 80s and 90s, the idea of gifts and ministries. But I think there's a very fertile ground in there for us to plow and to gain from. So, with elders, we have said our local elders who are born and bred in one context and whose only experiences in that one context are going to hire their expertise from outside, but they can fire that expertise at any moment, at any time.
Yeah.
If someone doesn't like it, they can, the preacher gets fired. I've often said on the chessboard, the only movable piece is the minister. So when anything starts going wrong, it's the minister who moves, because the elders and deacons, that's their home. That's where they live. And no one's going to fire them because they're going to stay around there. So we've got to move to the idea of gifts and ministries. And there's something in our elder polity model that you take dynamic men, very successful in their business life, very entrepreneurial in their business life, able to make decisions, to assess what needs to be done, and to do those well. When they get into around the elder table, they kind of all get the same sickness. And we've kind of democratized to the lowest link, to the weakest link element. I've seen so many elderships that are just bound by the weakest link, and the weakest link is usually the most fearful person in the room.
Right.
And so when anything comes up about a change or about a need to address something, the fear takes over. And even when a decision is made, eventually it comes back to we can't implement because we have the fearful person who leads. And so we've got to be able to express those things. Gifts and ministries allows us to say who is gifted to make decisions, who can make decisions well, quickly, who can assess things, put it on the table, put it into words so the rest of us can do it. Not everyone can chair an elders meeting. Not everyone's gifted, but yet some elderships, everyone has to chair every month. Someone's going to move around, and when you get the person who can't do it, everything comes to a halt. And so all that promotes that maintenance mentality, that maintenance mindset to us. And again, that weakest link, we go to the weakest link in our church.
Yeah.
I sat down with a group of elders who said, we can't make this decision because Sister so-and-so, who's 86 years old, she wouldn't be able to understand it, and so we can't do it.
Right.
And then they said, but she won't leave here. If we stuck a piece of dynamite under her seat, she wouldn't leave. And so that weakest link mentality there. So we've got to change that. It doesn't mean we don't need elders.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not that elders can only be in that shepherding, doing the pastoral care roles. Mm-hmm. But it means by giftedness, we allow people with the gifts that we need to carry out those gifts and to recognize them. Our ministers, we've gone 75 years in our universities training pastoral care ministers. It's going to be really hard to change the model, but we've got to move to a more apostolic prophetic model than a teacher-preacher model.
Okay.
I know a lot of preachers, they want to preach good sermons on Sunday morning, but they don't have a clue how to lead people. Maybe we connect them with MBA, and instead of separating ourselves out into graduate schools of theological education, maybe we go and join up with some business people and learn how to lead, learn how to make plans, learn how to figure out what needs to happen. So we're going to have to make a shift in our ministers, and that's going to, I think, would attract some good ministers for us who right now go, I have a good friend. I don't know how wealthy the guy is. He's really wealthy, but he says regularly, Stan said I got out of the Bible department at Harding because you and Mike Cope and Randy Harris were there, and I couldn't compete with you guys. So I got out and went to Harvard and got an MBA and made $1 billion. What if we took minds like that and allowed them to bring their creativity into leading in churches? I think we have a new dynamic. Accountability is still required. Bobby Clinton at Fuller, he struck an arrow deep and fast in my soul one day when he said, if you're going to wield spiritual authority, you must first learn to submit to spiritual authority. That's a hard lesson for a lot of us, but that's where eldership is really powerful, that we've got to be accountable and submit ourselves to others. And that's a good part of our polity system. So there's things that we're going to have to reshape and and change, and it's going to be difficult to do.
Yeah. I guess the one thing that just in my 10 years of ministry in 3 different churches in Georgia, Central Valley, California, and here in the South Bay is just seeing the problem of kind of a vision, strategy, values, and like, okay, what are we actually trying to accomplish? There was a total lack of all that clarity. And so that became a very big passion of mine, to the point of taking Will Mancini's class at Fuller on visioning. And that was an awesome experience. And but I just saw in 10 years with those 3 different churches in my own home congregation, the deep need to go through that tough process of, trotting through that tough, lengthy process. That's not easy. It's hard for churches to do. I was part of 1 or 2 that tried to do that, and it just didn't go well. And so, I mean, how would you advise leadership then to go through that process of revisioning, trying to figure out a pathway forward that they'll come up with something useful and to implement?
Mm-hmm. Well, I tried to do that in my book, Empty Church.
Oh, okay.
The full title is Empty Church: Why People Don't Come and What to Do About It.
Yeah.
Because that's what churches are facing. I try to help them to learn from the people around them, to learn from their neighborhoods. So as I do church consulting, I'll do it on an 18-month process, and we use a simple in, out, up. Comes from 3DM, Mike Breen, Alex Absalom, a couple of names that have been associated with 3DM. And they use missional communities as kind of their big piece. But the idea is you need to find your neighborhood or your network that becomes your people, that you're going to claim them in the name of Jesus, and you're going to serve that group of people. So most churches are in the neighborhood, so that's an easy one for them to get to. So we start looking at their neighborhood and trying to learn their neighborhood and help them to ask the questions that their neighbors are asking, instead of the demands they had. One of the churches I'm working with right now, one of their elders met someone from their neighborhood at the edge of the church parking lot. She said, I have never been inside your building. As long as we've lived here and you've been here, I've never been inside. And he didn't know how to do that. And as we were coaching, I said, that would be a great time to say, well, let me give you a tour. Mm-hmm. He just stopped and he said, I never thought of that. And so the people that are out there are going to lead us to those kinds of questions, and they begin to help us see ourselves from an external perspective. Most churches think they're very friendly, but you get someone who's brand new from outside, it doesn't feel that way to them. But when we start making those friends and they start coming with us and we hear their perspective, all of a sudden it raises new questions. It helps us to give new frames of vocabulary and experiences, so that we are now going like this instead of like this. Because so many of our churches now and their culture around us are just not meeting. We want to get together and meet them. That's the essential. But then in the 18 months, we start by we talk about design or default. Mm-hmm. Are you working from a default perspective? Are you designing it? Mm-hmm. And simple things like look at your stage area. I've been in so many churches that their stage has not changed since maybe 1990, and we're in 2020. Yeah, but the same ficus trees are up there.
There might be a PowerPoint screen, but that's about it.
That may be it. And I hate to say it, but it probably has the paperless hymnal on it, which is a death knell.
Yeah.
It's just the way it is. So how do you make that a stage? And so we talk about what happens on a stage. Things change. I went to the church that it was, for us, we called it our secret church. It was in Portland, and while we were ministering Kairos, we'd go there because no one knew our name. It was the opposite of Cheers, and we wanted it that way. We walked in one day, and the stage was a mess. It had old tires and boxes and just pieces of wood and chain link fence and junk on it. We were there for the first day of a 7-week series on Romans.
Mm-hmm.
By the time we got to the end of the 7 weeks, it was the transforming of your mind, and the stage was now, all that same stuff was there, but it had become beautiful. And through those 7 weeks, we got to see that stage create the message that the minister was bringing to us from Romans. So our stage is where things happen. A stage has communication ability to it. A stage should raise our interest. It should raise our level of inquiry of what's going to happen today. Because whenever God shows up, everything changes. And most of our churches, all they're looking to do is make sure all the prayers are taken care of and the songs are there and we've done everything decently in order, but we don't ever ask, did God show up today? We've got to ask, does God show up? And what happens when he shows up? And so that begins to change everything. So default to design, maintenance to missional. And then we talk about a growth engine, a church growth engine, and start helping them get their cylinders starting to work in their growth engine. And the end result is more leaders. In the first 3 months, we'll usually double or triple the number of leaders that they have, because each in, out, and up has an action team, and the action team has new leaders in it. And it can't be anyone from the staff or the elders. Mm-hmm. And so they're raising new leaders, and they're beginning to empower those leaders, and those leaders are asking new questions. And the end goal is just 5 new families at the end of 18 months.
Yeah.
Can you bring in 5 new families?
Yeah.
Because then that starts things moving and new questions and gets us going, I think, more in that mission-oriented direction.
Okay.
It's really good. So, Stan, I really liked this image that you're using from kind of default to design. I mean, I think in some ways, as we've been talking in our episodes, we've been talking about how the default retirement vehicles are not necessarily working for a lot of people, not just in America in general, but as Churches of Christ ministers are kind of a microcosm of that. And we've had a few experts on, but as you're thinking about that move from kind of default to design, I mean, I hear your stuff with real estate. It's an active thing. It's not a passive income. It's a very active income. As I hear you talk about the church growth models and these kind of things, like this is really intentional stuff that you're doing. There's a design to it that's really working. So as you've worked with Kairos and the stuff for 15 years, this is question 5. Can you explain what you did in teaching your church planters to do in terms of accumulating assets for retirement? Did you guys incorporate that as you were launching new churches? Did you talk a little bit about retirement asset accumulation for the ministers who were serving with Kairos?
Yeah, we did. It wasn't a huge piece, but it was there. So one of the things we did was any new church planter that we started working with, we provided them a consult with a pastoral tax person. And we found one that we just thought the world of. She was great. She knew ministerial tax. And so we would set up, and Kairos would pay for that, to sit down with her for an hour to talk through, what kind of records do you need to take, and what do you get to take off of your taxes, and how do you do that? And we would pay for their first year tax through that person. if they wanted to do that. So we wanted to first get that sense of, you kind of are in a bit of a privileged place as a minister in our U.S. tax system, and so how do you take the best advantage of what our government has said we want to provide for you? So that was number one, and then we would, if they didn't have a personal financial advisor, we had someone that we would use, and again, we do the same thing. We'd introduce them and set up a time for them to visit with that personal tax advisor and at least hear what it's like and what some options were. They were under no obligation to go with this person for any of the services. But we always encourage them, wherever you're at, find that person that you trust, that speaks your language, who can help you with your personal finances. So those were the two things that we built into our system for thinking about retirement. Mm-hmm. We didn't go much further than that, but that's probably further than a lot of churches go to.
Yeah.
We weren't able to provide any assets or contributions or anything that we would have loved to do that, but we didn't have those kinds of finances. But we did talk with them then about how you've got to build people in your church and in your support team who really had your best interest in heart. So as they went out to get their support, we use Support Raising Solutions as a model, a great program to help them. We didn't want them to go out and say, well, I've got 70% of my salary, so I'm okay. And they said, no, you're not okay until you got 100%. And so we'd work with them under budgets to get appropriate budgets and say, no, this is what you need, and you need to get 100% of that together. So, just trying to help get that mindset in place. And then as we worked with their financial teams in their churches, and part of that training of their financial teams was, how do you take care of your minister? And how do you know when your minister is telling you really what's going on and when they're not really telling you what's going on? Yeah. So how do you build up your support as a new church, for your minister? So that's about as far as we took it, but we tried to set those foundations into place for them.
Got it. That's good. That's good. As we wind down this conversation, like 10-ish minutes left or so, you are also the vice chairman for an organization called Heritage 21 Foundation. Can you explain what Heritage 21 is to those who aren't aware of it yet? First off, and then I'll follow up with another question.
Okay. Yeah, Heritage 21, it came out of our work in starting new churches. And we saw some churches make some of the most horrible mistakes at the end of their life when they would close. Mm-hmm. And they might have $1 million of real estate or something like that. And by the time everything was said and done, I wouldn't say they'd squandered the money in every circumstance, but many they did.
Okay.
And we thought, how can we rescue those resources that God has already given our fellowship for new kingdom work and growth? Mm-hmm. And so as we've been doing that, we realized that when churches get down below 50 in their numbers and they're older, don't have those young people in, what happens is they start losing their leadership, and then they start losing their ability to make decisions that are good decisions. So Heritage 21 is here to, number one, help churches with assessment and to decide where are they at in their life cycle, a church life cycle. Churches have a life cycle like a human does. Most churches tend to live about as long as human beings do, which makes sense when a church starts to serve the generation that they are starting in. That's right. What they're designed to do. And by the time you get to grandparents and great-grandparents, they're not serving those generations anymore, those new ones. So that's why we need new churches. But to help those churches understand where they are, the normalcy of coming to the end of life, to do estate planning as a church, to decide before they get to crisis. what do we need to do? Where can we help people, and where can we help the kingdom the most? And then to help them with revitalization, if they have that option, if it's they haven't gone so far down that they don't have that option. So we do consulting with churches and help them grow and try to hit that revitalization button. And if they don't, then we provide those services to where they can literally say, we don't have the energy, we don't have the resources, we are tired, we need to give this up. They can turn it over to Heritage 21, and we'll help them make their transitions out of the building, give them the time that they need, and then sell the building and whatever that church has said in their estate plan. Of where the money goes, then Heritage 21 will be the trustee to make sure that their estate gets handled the way they want it to be handled. So we're trying to help churches not feel bad about closing, to make it a normal part of life, to give them some tools to move forward if they can, and if they can't, give them tools to close out well in a way we call it grace-filled and faithful. Mm. And that's what we'd like to help them to do. And as doing that, it goes to help the other side of ministry life, of new churches and missions and evangelism, and moving things forward to get that next generation of new people into God's kingdom.
And so, based upon that experience with Heritage 21 and the churches that you've worked with, what have you learned, if anything, about kind of where ministers are at those churches in terms of financially preparing for retirement?
Yeah, most of the ministers in those churches, if they still have any, they're coming in, so they become the safety net for people who have already retired out of their ministry. Okay. So they get $150, $200 a week to supplement their income. That's generally what we find at that stage.
Got it. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, I know. It's interesting living in the South Bay, not being far away from Santa Cruz. Santa Cruz is on the coast. You probably heard of it recently in the news about from all the atmospheric rivers kind of really pounding all those oceanside towns. Santa Cruz is known for being like Portland, weird, right? And yet the churches, especially Churches of Christ in Santa Cruz, are very, very conservative, and they're very small. And I tried to get some of that kind of income by helping them out preaching, and yet somebody like me who goes to Fuller, and doesn't adhere to some of the basic, very conservative Church of Christ tenets of, let's say, women's roles and instrumental music, they're unwilling to bring me in to speak. And so I just found that to be very, very, very interesting, at least on the West Coast. Growing up back east, you think everybody thinks and assumes California is liberal, but California has some very, very conservative pockets, Central Valley, and even in where you don't even think they would be, we're on the coast.
Yeah, San Jose.
Yeah. And so, Santa Cruz, those at least that one I'm aware of in Santa Cruz is kind of like what you were talking about there. It's for those guys who have already retired to come in and speak, and they actually, from what I learned, that they bring in somebody all the way from the Central Valley who wasn't even, I think, a minister in order to preach for them, and that's kind of a shame, because there's a lot of others who could help them out to a lot closer. But in terms of wrapping up this conversation, based upon all of your life experience with Heritage 21, the new book you just have written, Empty Church, you can find it on Amazon if you're interested in reading that. Kairos, teaching, missionary, minister. What is some parting wisdom or advice or encouragement for pastors and or churches on the matter of accumulating assets for retirement? As we keep talking about, we're in this context referred to by Gil Ducci as the American DIY retirement crisis. What, if anything, do you have to offer to close this out?
Well, I wish there was more, I could say about the DIY, but that's where it is. So I think number one, and I did this at church that I retired out of as executive minister in Arkansas. I sat down with the younger staff and we went through this. So number one, you've got to do it yourself. That doesn't matter what you're going to get from a church. It will never match what someone's going to get from the business world. So you're going to have to do it yourself. So number one, be in the Social Security system, get that foundation in there. Number two, if the church does offer things that will be helpful, if they have any kind of a retirement system, take it and do it to the max. So if it's matching, match it out to the max. Then number two or three, I would say, I think you guys are right on, Jordan, with these index funds, annuities, and whole life funds. That you may not get the big score out of it, but you've got something that is going to take what you put into it, will make it grow, and will give you a very certain income. That might, between those, you might get to 50% of your income that you'd want to have. I don't think anymore. I don't see how anyone will be able to save their way in retirement anymore. So you have to invest your way into retirement.
Okay.
So that's why I think that third piece, it becomes a type of investment vehicle that most ministers could do.
Okay.
It takes a lot of discipline to do it, but I think most people could. For us, we put $14,000 a year for 10 years into one. And it took a lot.
Yeah.
But we had been paying that through to universities, and so we just switched the money over to that retirement vehicle when our last child graduated from university. So we just kept it up and kept going with that. And then find the way that you can. How can you invest? What fits your level of ability? And you call it risk, but it's not risk as much as it is management. Your ability of management. So we chose real estate because that's what I was familiar with and what I felt comfortable with, and what through my experience I saw as being the most advantageous to us. And that funds the other 50% of things. So that you got to make that decision of how do you get to that other spot. But the big thing is you've got to be willing to say this is on me to do this. No one else is going to take care of that. And even those in the best churches, you still hear things like, well, ministers, if you make too much money, that you get criticized. If you don't make enough money, you don't handle money well. And if you retire and can't pay for your retirement, you've been a slacker. Yeah. And that's just what you tend to hear. So find those people who can help you well, and make sure that you're taking care of yourself as you're doing your ministry, because you're the only one that's going to be able to do that in the end.
Okay.
I hope that's not a downer. I hope that's some
no,
encouragement there.
No, not at all. It's very encouraging. Lars, do you want to follow up to that at all?
Oh, I appreciate what you've had to share with us, Stan. I think that sometimes it's the way you hear it, right? The way you receive it. So my hope is people do receive this as just a little bit of a clarifying, speaking truth and saying, hey, don't wait around for somebody to take care of this for yourself. And it's not something that, I think we've talked about the image of retirement. Sometimes people are like, I'm not going to retire because I don't want to go off into the sunset and just sit on the beach and be in vacation. I want to be contributing to the kingdom. And well, that's not the kind of retirement we're talking about. We're saying you need to save, you need to be proactive, you need to not wait passively for the things that are going to provide you the ability to do some of the things you're doing now with Heritage 21 and what you've been able to do with Kairos throughout the years, to serve the kingdom in unique ways that maybe aren't as located in the specific ministry that they got paid for the time that they were of working age. We're still serving God's kingdom. And so I think the way we should receive that invitation is to say, God has a calling for your life. that may be outside the context that you're in right now. And he's inviting you to join in that in a very active way, to pursue that in a really active way. So, I think that's the way I received it. I think that's an important message.
There are always people who are going to be, if you can find those 2 or 3 people who can be great financial mentors for you, grab hold of them and make a team of them on your behalf, because it will bless them and it'll bless you to do that. And that can be a very powerful piece in your life.
I did not have that, but my experience in 2020 of trying to see what it would be like to be a financial professional and going through that a year was, I guess, the impetus that I needed in terms of figuring out, okay, I'm more aware of what is out there. Maybe IULs, when I first heard about them and learned about them, which many people have not, I was like, man, that really sounds like that would be helpful for pastors and maybe even churches, and because most people haven't heard about that. So maybe we need to tell more people about that, fixed index annuities and so forth. So it's, that's good. Hopefully most pastors have somebody like that in their lives. If not already, they need to, like you said, seek one out and not wait to see if anybody might find them.
Again, I would encourage people to get a team. I love threes. Threes are powerful. Yeah. You get 3 people who can be part of your life team to help you with that. What a tremendous blessing that is. Yeah. Just very, very, very powerful for you.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, Stan, thank you very much for being a part of this podcast episode today. Again, your book, Empty Church, it just came out, right, this year?
It came out last year, 2022.
Okay.
It's available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Okay. So I'd encourage churches to get it, and it raises good questions. I sat down with a group of elders a couple months ago, and they said, oh, good. We were so afraid that what you would tell us we need to do, but we can do this. And we can. We can do. Jordan, thank you. Your work that you're doing there at Fuller, it is going to be I think a dynamic piece that's been empty for a lot of ministers and pastors. So glad that you're spreading it around. Lars, thanks for being part of this. And you guys are in the building part of your life. Build on.
We're trying. Thank you for the encouragement. And if you are listening or watching this episode right now, just anticipate about 8 more episodes coming out in the next course of couple courses of next couple weeks or months. Hopefully we'll churn these out for you in a timely manner. But until next episode, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. Bye. Once again, thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Almost Essential podcast. If you like what you heard and you want to reach out, you can connect with me, Jordan Koss, on Facebook or Instagram. We hope this series is a valuable resource for you, pastor or otherwise. And remember, you are not almost essential. Your role and service in the church is essential, as well as saving for retirement within your holy vocation and calling.